everybody. Thank you so much for being here for our follow-up symposium to the award symposium for Mahzareen Banaji. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce three speakers that have taken research on implicit bias and the IAT beyond the computer screen into our daily lives, illuminating the role of implicit bias in the domains like the workplace, our interactions with the justice system, and the care we receive when we are sick. But most of all, I think that we currently find ourselves in a time when explicit prejudice suddenly seems normative, and our civilians are dying either right before or while in police custody, and hate crimes are spiking. So it is all the more imperative for us to understand the social cognitive underpinnings of the overt actions that actually make it to the surface. So that being said, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Modupe Akinola from Columbia Business School. Thank you.
Hey, well, good afternoon, everybody. I figured that the best way to start off this talk was to highlight some of the faces that have been parts of the media, the tragedies that we've seen going on in the news. And for some reason, yes, here's one of these faces. Countless African Americans, unarmed, who have been shot by police and are 4 times more likely than their white counterparts to be shot by police, which does indeed suggest that implicit bias exists in policing. And so what I wanted to do today in this talk is highlight 3 things, or focus on 3 topics. The first topic I wanted to focus on is some of the research we're very familiar with on implicit bias in policing. But then I'm currently part of some reform efforts to change and reduce implicit and explicit bias in policing. So I want to just give you some information, let you know what's going on, because there's so much that I've learned in the 2 years in which I've been involved in these processes. And then finally, I wanted to talk about how we can integrate what we know as social scientists with practice, what's going on in the field to result in enduring cultural change in these police departments. So 1999, Amadou Diallo, an unarmed black man who was shot 41 times by police officers because they thought he was carrying a gun when all he was doing was reaching for his wallet. Situations like this and others prompted social psychologists to try to understand, is there bias in weapon detection? And people like Josh Carell and others started these tests, these shoot, don't shoot exercises, computerized exercises to get a sense of, well, what's going on here? And they did find that individuals are faster and more accurate at identifying a handgun as a weapon when seeing a black face relative to a white face. They also found that individuals shoot armed targets more frequently and more quickly when those targets are black rather than white. But these were mostly with civilians, with college students run in a lab. And so when they ran these studies on police officers, they didn't find these same effects, which they attributed to practice, to expertise, to training. Now, I study stress and performance, and one of the things that struck me about this research is that they hadn't quite looked at these effects under conditions of stress, when officers are in this type of stressful situation that they might face in the real world. So one question I was interested in asking or answering with my collaborator, Wendy Mendez, was how does stress affect officers and their decisions to fire weapons? Now, what role might stress play in this relationship? We know that stress is associated with vigilance and intergroup interactions. We know that stress can facilitate recall of danger, and also that it can affect performance on decision-making tasks. So the idea was that under stress, it might be more likely that stereotypes get activated such that when one sees a black face paired with a gun, you might be more likely to shoot because that is stereotype congruent, rather than when seeing a white face paired with a gun. Now, one way to look at or examine stress is using biological products, specifically looking at hormones that are associated with stress, such as cortisol. Now, cortisol increases in the context of physical and psychological stressors, and it is true that small increases in cortisol can have positive effects. It gives you a burst of energy for survival reasons, but it's also related to enhanced vigilance and attentiveness for threat cues. So we were interested in understanding how does stress-induced cortisol reactivity influence shooter decisions. And one might think, well, if it facilitates danger and attentiveness, then maybe officers might be good at these tasks under stress. But one can also think that stress can make you freeze, making you worse at these types of tasks. So we set out to examine this among police officers in a Massachusetts police department. And this was a diverse set of officers, although predominantly male, as you see in most forces. And here's what we did. We took a saliva sample, which was assayed for cortisol, and then officers engaged in a stressful role play to increase their cortisol levels, after which they engaged in the same types of shoot, don't shoot exercises, computerized exercises that I mentioned earlier. And then we took another saliva sample, assayed for cortisol, to look at cortisol reactivity. And just to remind you of these shoot, don't shoot tasks, you see images of young men, targets set against realistic backgrounds, and half of these targets are typically black or white, and half of them are armed or unarmed. And they gain points for an accurate decision versus an inaccurate decision. So what then did we find? Well, first of all, one of the things we were interested in, because it's a key mechanism underlying shooter bias is stereotype activation, is that we expected that in stereotype congruent trials, so when you see an armed black man or an unarmed white target, that's when you would see fewer errors, greater accuracy. In incongruent trials, you might expect to see more errors. And so here on the x-axis, I have whether the target was armed or unarmed. On the y-axis, I have error rates. And here's what we saw. With black targets, across the board, officers performed pretty well when the targets were black, and they performed worse when the targets were white. Now, this is different and counter to the media, to what we typically see, because they weren't bad with these unarmed black targets. And in fact, if you compare our results with some of the civilian results from other studies, it seems as if officers had a competency with black targets. And one question is, was this competency due to training, due to the stress they might have been experiencing? But one thing I do want to highlight is that this is still a problem, and this is still a bias going on. But the question is really, well, what is happening to make them equally have the similar error rates with the black targets? So we looked at their cortisol reactivity, their stress reactivity during the task. And here on the x-axis, I have cortisol reactivity. Higher levels are related to greater stress. And what we found with black targets was that as their stress levels increased, as officers' stress levels increased, they were more accurate in their decisions. And we did not see this relationship with the white targets. Now, there are lots of potential moderators, the race of the officer, years as an officer. We didn't find that these had any effects. So to quickly summarize, the officers did perform well in the decision-making task under stress. They were responsive to these threatening cues, and as cortisol levels increased, they were more accurate in their decision-making, but their performance was strongest when there were black targets. And so this begs the question of, well, why was that the case? Was there something unique in this department? What was really going on here? And one thing to note is that in our current study, it was about stress, but we didn't know how the officers might perform not under stress. So we ran a follow-up study and saw these same similar effects. So we asked them, well, what do you think is going on? Why is it that there is a greater competence with black targets? And here's one of the things they said. were sensitive to racial profiling in this department. They weren't surprised at the results. They work hard at making sure that there isn't bias. And in fact, there was an African-American police chief commissioner who had worked really hard at making sure and examining racial profiling. And so their answers to us suggested that if you change the culture and climate of these departments, then it can help reduce bias from the standpoint of reducing the degree to which we might see Black targets being treated differentially. Now, this point brings me to the second topic that I wanted to talk about, which is, well, how is it that we actually create and have these reform efforts that do change the cultures of these departments? And as I mentioned, I knew nothing about these reform efforts until I became involved in Cleveland's reform efforts. And so part of this is educational. How can we as social scientists, A, know what's going on in the real world when it comes to implicit bias in policing, and B, how can we actually make meaningful change? So we've all heard of situations like this in Cleveland, and in Ferguson, and in Miami, and in Chicago. And as a result of these incidents, the Department of Justice has issued consent decrees between police departments and the DOJ. If you're anything like me, you have no idea, or you might have no idea what a consent decree is. So let me tell you what one of these is. The DOJ can actually sue and investigate a police department for violating the Constitution if they think that they might have violated the Constitution. And so if they find reasonable cause, then they enter into a settlement agreement with the department. Once the settlement agreement occurs, the police department is required to institute these specific changes in a given amount of time. For instance, Cleveland has 5 years to turn things around. And a federal judge is appointed, and they oversee and enforce the settlement agreement, and then an independent monitoring team is hired by the judge to oversee the implementation of this consent decree. And I am on the monitoring team in Cleveland, one of the few social psychologists on the team, but it's also comprised of people in law enforcement, people who have expertise in law, have expertise in policing. So it's a broad team with diverse expertise, about 20 people trying to make sure this change occurs. Here are numerous cities in which there are consent decrees, and to give you a sense of the key focus of many of these consent decrees, well, as you would expect, new training to reduce bias and implicit and explicit bias, better internal investigations to make sure that things aren't going on within the department that have lots of issues, external review boards to make sure that allegations of racial profiling are actually examined and examined thoroughly. Community policing, this is a term you hear a lot, and it's the idea that no, we don't need to just have relationships with the police when something bad happens, but it's ongoing, real relationships where people get to know each other, strong intergroup interactions. Also procedures to make sure, and policies that ensure that force isn't used unnecessarily, making sure that there's trust between citizens and civilians, and then, as we all see and hear on the news, implementing body cameras and dashboard cameras to be able to watch what officers are doing. Now, here are some of the many ways in which social psychologists and others have been involved in police efforts. Many have engagements with these police departments to really look at police-community relationships to come up with remedies to solve some of the key problems that are going on. So Jennifer Eberhardt, Hazel Marcus, and a team at Stanford has done this with the Oakland Police Department. Also, their collaborations with police departments to make sure that they're standardizing and tracking different statistics across departments. And I can't tell you how important this is because, for instance, in Cleveland, if you ask them for their stop, search, and arrest data by race and by gender, they will have nothing to give you because they don't track it in this way. So the consent decree requires them to do so. And one of the things that Phil Goff and his colleagues are doing at the Center for Policing Equity is collecting national statistics, and A, ensuring that all of these departments do collect these data, and then B, being able to say, well, what are the rates that we should expect if we are collecting these data? And finally, in my case, there are opportunities to serve on these court-appointed monitoring teams to be able to make sure that the changes that are asked about in the consent decree are taking place. And let me tell you a little bit about what we've actually learned in these processes. No surprise, racial disparities do indeed exist, in case you didn't know. But one of the critical areas is that cultural beliefs and practices and policies really encourage these racial disparities. So that's where a lot of the change needs to be made. Data isn't collected in a standardized way, as I mentioned earlier, and not using the best systems. If you ask for data, sometimes people will give you a ledger. For you millennials, a ledger is a binder that is paper where people write in pencil what's going on. This is the 21st century, but that's how data are being collected. And then also training on procedural justice and implicit bias and other things, woefully inadequate. And finally, the stress and the pressure that people are under, that these officers are under, the paperwork that they're so behind in that prevents them from actually engaging in community policing, allows you to really think about and ask the question about how can we further integrate what we know, what we do as social scientists in a way that we can bring it to practice to make sure that the cultural change that is necessary in these departments is actually happening. And so that's the final topic that I want to talk about here, is what can we do based on what we know to make sure that there is enduring, lasting cultural change in these departments. And we know from social psychology so much about how to change intergroup interactions. We know so much from organizational behavior, organizational psychology, of how to make sure that diversity results in good performance outcomes and not in negative performance outcomes. And we also know from social psychophysiology about how the body responds to stress and ways in which to make these responses ones that are adaptive and result in good outcomes instead of impaired outcomes. And so I want to just talk a little bit more about our science and, importantly, about interventions that I think we should and can continue to do in these departments that result in this lasting change. For decades, we've been studying intergroup contact and the processes that allow for individuals of different backgrounds to actually reduce stereotypes. We know that one important aspect is giving people opportunities to be friends, personal interactions, having common goals. When you create these environments, then that can result in reduced stereotyping and reducing prejudice. So how can we use what we know and what we do in the lab? How can we use and implement fast friends paradigms in these departments in an effort so that the officers themselves get to know each other well? And let me tell you, within these departments, relationships are really fractured. And so how can we expect there to be good community policing, good cross-race interactions outside of the department when within the department they are so terrible? So paradigms like this, paradigms like difference education, where you really get to know and understand meaningfully how people differ across race. If we can do these within the department, then it obviously will have some benefits in terms of reducing implicit bias. And furthermore, there is research showing that these enduring relationships can have an effect on your physiology, on your stress responses. In fact, Liz Paguch-Gould, who you heard just a few minutes ago, has done research showing that when you induce these fast friends paradigms, these interventions, then that can reduce people's stress responses and actually help them in having even more cross-race interactions. So the question is, how can we use these and take them into these police departments so that we can have this lasting change that we're wanting, that we need? Now, in organizational behavior, while in social psychology we call it intergroup interactions, we call it diversity in organizational behavior. And there is a ton of work looking at what are the factors that allow for diversity to result in positive performance outcomes. And if you apply to policing, it's how can we have good types of relationships so that people aren't shooting black men who are unarmed? And one of the things we know is that one of the key moderators is time. When people spend time with people who are different from them, that can result in great performance outcomes. When people have mindsets that show that diversity is enhancing, that it can actually help and be beneficial, that's when you see solid relationships and solid outcomes. And more recently, there have been theories that integrate and incorporate what we know about the body's responses to stress and look at these responses as mediators, as mechanisms that help explain how and when diversity can have great performance outcomes. And the reason I mention this is that it gives us a new lens through which to use and to do these interventions in these police departments. Because what these theories now allow us to do is to intervene at the level of stress management. So we know that interventions such as reappraisal of arousal can change how anxious people might feel in certain situations, resulting in good performance outcomes. Can we do the same, use these same types of interventions in police departments? Or interoception, when you understand what your body is doing and how it's responding, that can change how you experience negative emotions. Or even if you change your mindset about stress so that you realize that stress isn't always debilitating, that it can actually be enhancing, then interventions like this within these police departments have the potential to help reduce implicit bias in policing. And one thing that is wonderful about the work that Mahzarin and others have done is that it has encouraged and fostered the use of implicit bias training in these departments, but we know for sure that implicit bias training is not enough. And so my hope is that this talk has at least whet your appetite and given you some sense of how each and every person's in here, our research can be valuable and meaningful in reducing implicit bias in policing. Because my hope is that in the future, that rather than seeing faces and experiences and hearing about tragedies like this, we will instead hear about faces and see faces and experiences that are more like this, because this is the type of 21st century policing that we really want. Thank you.
I'm Lou Penner. I'm at Corona's Cancer Institute in Wayne State University, and I'm going to talk about the effects of implicit physician bias in racially discordant medical interactions. I want to begin this talk with talking about a little background. In 2003, I left the traditional psychology department and moved to a medical school and a cancer center. And while I have a long time interest in racism and prejudice, my research had moved away from that. And then when I found myself in the medical school, my research focus moved to health-related issues. And the problem of interest that immediately struck me was the persistent and pervasive racial disparities in health. Let me present a little bit of data. These are data from the CDC on all-cause mortality rates in 1960 and then in 2013, this most recent year that I could find data for. So it's a 53-year period. As you can see, people have gotten significantly healthier over that 53-year period. But what you also notice is, if you look at the numbers above the blue bar, that's the disparity in all-cause mortality rate. And essentially, the disparity in all-cause mortality rate over that period of time has not changed at all. If we look at the area that I do my work in, and that is cancer, we can compare mortality rates for black and white women with breast cancer. What you notice, although these data are a little bit old, actually it's changed. Now black and white women are about equally likely to have breast cancer. But notice there is no difference to speak of in incidence between black and white women with regard to developing breast cancer. But if you move across to the other side of the graph, what you notice is that the mortality rate for black women is much higher than it is for white women. And I could, if I had the time, put up similar graphs for almost every major cancer you can think of. And with the exception of those cancers which have very, very short survival rates, these differences are replicated. And finally, one of the things I confronted when I had this change in my career and was looking at health disparities from the perspective of a social psychologist is what I was told by people is it's all SES. Well, we can look at the effects of SES and we see two things. We see that overall it's true, wealthier, better educated people are healthier, but the disparity between blacks and whites is even greater. These data are the proportion of the people sampled who said that their health was only fair or poor. And notice that blacks are more likely to report that than whites, both overall and among people who are wealthy. So SES does make people healthier, but it doesn't eliminate the racial disparity. Well, why does this racial disparity in health exist? Well, historically in medicine, it was attributed to genetic, biological, or medical causes, and that produced health status differences. But then in 2003, the Institute of Medicine report on healthcare disparities came to a very different explanation of why minorities, not only blacks, but my talk focuses on black-white disparities, why their health was not as good as that of whites. And to quote them, they said racial and ethnic minorities tend to receive a lower quality of health care than non-minorities, even when access-related factors such as patients' insurance and income are controlled. So what the panel said was one of the major reasons why blacks are not as healthy as whites is because they're getting poorer medical care. In fact, we know that to be the case. These are data from a CDC agency that specifically tasked with looking at the quality of health care. And what you see here is that blacks are about 4 times as likely to get worse health care than whites as they are to get better health care than whites, and they're almost equally likely to get worse health care than whites as they are to get the same health care. So what this tells us is that blacks are not invariably receiving poorer health care than whites, but the difference is much more common that they will be receiving inferior health care. Now, this brings us to the focus of my talk, which is racial disparities in clinical interactions. One of the things we know and is critical to what I'm talking about today is that over 80% of black patients' clinical interactions will be racially discordant. They will be with a non-black provider. And when these interactions are compared to white patients in racially concordant interactions, we find that the racially discordant ones are shorter, less positive and productive, less informative, less patient-centered. There's less physician-patient engagement, less patient participation in decision-making, and they're less satisfying to the patients. So now we have to change the model. And we have to say, well, it's not simply genetic and biological differences, and it's not simply social causes, that is harsh environments, which lower SES people are going to be more likely to be exposed to. There's also disparities in the health care that they receive. But there was one other conclusion that came from the IO panel, which was the most controversial and the most striking. They said that one of the major causes of these healthcare disparities was at the patient and provider level. The sources of these disparities, they said, were complex. They're rooted in historic and contemporary inequities, and they involve healthcare professionals and their patients. But here is the one that made the heart of a social psychologist beat faster. They said that the major patient and provider causes were race-related attitudes, specifically healthcare provider prejudice or bias and minority patient mistrust or refusal. Today I'm only going to talk about healthcare provider prejudice or bias. But now we have to go to a still more modern model. And that is when we talk about why are there differences in health status between blacks and whites, we have to include race-related thoughts and feelings. And that's what I focus on in the research that I do with my colleagues at Kamala's Cancer Institute. This is the model that we use which guides our work. It's a little bit busy, but basically what it says is that when doctors and patients enter a clinical interaction, they do not do a tabula rasa. They bring with them race-related attitudes which are made more salient by the fact that the interactions we're talking about are racially discordant. And so for the patient, we believe the major race-related attitudes are perceived discrimination, mistrust, and suspicion. For the physicians, we believe it's racial bias and stereotyping. And what I want to point out about this schematic that we have is notice that these race-related thoughts and feelings not only affect the patient and the physician's own behavior, these also affect they run across that. That is, the attitudes that the physician brings to the interaction affect the patient, and the attitudes that the patient brings to the interaction affects the physician, how they communicate and how they perceive one another. And then we believe that this has substantial implications for long-term outcomes, treatment decisions, both immediate and longer term. So first I want to present some of the data that we have on physician race-related attitudes in racially discordant interactions. And I want to begin this by saying, well, why did we decide to study implicit physician attitudes, especially given the controversy that now exists about models of implicit attitudes? I feel compelled to talk about how we came to focus on implicit attitudes. Well, the first reason is, on average, we know that while physicians' level of explicit bias is relatively low, that their level of explicit bias is extremely high, almost a full standard deviation. These are data from Sabin and Greenwald and colleagues in 206 using data from 206, I think I can't read, 209, using data from Project Implicit. So we know, first of all, that physicians are high in implicit bias but relatively low in explicit bias. Further, in the practice of medicine, there's strong social and professional norms and legal prohibitions against openly displaying racial bias in clinical interaction. Thus, even if there is explicit bias, these expressions of conscious race-related attitudes are probably well controlled. But automatic, non-conscious expression of implicit bias may be much more difficult to control. So those were the theoretical reasons. Perhaps most importantly, to the work we've been doing for the last 14 years, we discovered that implicit attitudes worked. The first set of studies I want to talk about were done in a primary care clinic with 156 black patients and 18 non-black physicians. Before the interaction, we measured the physician's implicit and explicit bias. We measured patient past discrimination. And then post-interaction, we measured satisfaction and trust among the patients. And we had black and white observers rate thin slices of physician affects. We video record all the medical interactions that we study, which provides us with some really good insight into what transpires in that. And then the studies I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk specifically about how aversive racism affected patient perceptions of physicians and physicians' affect during the interactions. I'm sure most of the people in the room are familiar with the theory of aversive racism from Sam Gertner and Jack DeVideo. It basically describes a pattern of explicit and implicit attitudes where the explicit conscious attitudes are low and the implicit or non-conscious or unconscious attitudes are high. And so we examined how physicians' aversive racism first affected patient perceptions of the physicians. And this is a composite measure of patient satisfaction with the physician in the interaction. Okay, good, because my monitor just went blank. I'm glad yours didn't. And what you notice where the arrow is pointing is those are the aversive racist physicians. And what we find with the aversive racist physicians is the patients were significantly less satisfied with them. They also trusted them significantly less. Now, what is remarkable to me is I say we video record these interactions, and I'm embarrassed to tell you that when I watch the interactions, my biggest problem is that I start to fall asleep. These are highly scripted, 15-minute interactions in which I am embarrassed to tell you, see nothing. Yet in those 15-minute interactions, the black patients who are interacting with the aversive racist physicians are picking up on something. We're still not sure of all the dynamics that explain that. But what is remarkable is, first of all, that this pattern of explicit and implicit attitudes, which obviously the patients have no idea about, okay, are expressed in a manner that patients can pick that up in a 15-minute, highly structured interview. And I should say these patients are very low SES, obviously African-American patients, whose lives are extremely stressful, and what I call the radar that they have for picking this up is, to me, truly remarkable. Now let's move to the physicians. This is a study done by one of my former postdocs, Nao Hagawara. And in this, we looked at the effect of aversive racism on the affect displayed by the physician during the interaction. And the critical thing about this is we looked at that under two conditions. If they were interacting with a patient who had reported in the pretest that they had experienced a lot of past discrimination, or patients who said they had experienced none. When you look on the turned around on the left side of the graph on the left side rather, what you notice is that there's really no effect of aversive racism with the patients who report no past discrimination. But when you look on the right side, you see that for patients in conditions under which the patients had reported experiencing racial discrimination in the past, that physicians that fit the pattern of aversive racists, that is where the arrows it, they display significantly less positive affect. They also display significantly more negative affect. So the effect of aversive racism comes out only under the conditions where the patients are individuals who have reported high levels of past discrimination. One of the things we know about those patients is that they talk much more in the interactions. And we believe they may be, quote unquote, more difficult. So it's only under the conditions where the doctors are dealing with patients who are more assertive that we see the effects of aversive racism. This is quite consistent with the theory of aversive racism, in which it's believed that it manifests itself when there are other viable explanations that do not involve racial bias that either the person that holds them or others could use. So to summarize the results at this point, I don't know if you can see the bottom of that, but what it says, the doctor's showing the patient x-ray, and he says, that's the racist bone in your body you claimed you didn't have. So now I want to move on to our work in oncology settings. I discovered this morning when I checked in that it's important to replicate. I hadn't known that. That was a really startling revelation for me after more than 40 years of doing this. At any rate, we moved this work to an oncology setting. Again, it just turns out coincidentally, we had 18 non-black oncologists. We had 114 black oncology patients. This is the first time they'd met the oncologist. Some of them had just discovered that they had cancer as patients. Some had had surgery for their cancer and now had to get additional chemo. Post-interaction, we measured patient satisfaction and trust. And most importantly for this study, we measured their perception of the treatments that the physicians, the oncologists, recommended to them. We also, post-interaction, had black and white observers rate the physician on patient-centeredness. That is how much he or she appeared to care about the patient as a person. And then we examined how implicit bias affected physicians' behavior during the interaction and patient treatment expectations. Why didn't we include explicit bias? Well, we did, except we used the feelings thermometer, and what we discovered is that there was no variance in the data. Everybody felt, with the exception of 2 physicians, actually in our broader sample, there were 18 physicians we observed. In our broader sample, we had 40 physicians. Some of them didn't have patients, so they weren't included. That out of those 40, there were 2 that showed any racial preference or any racial bias. One was less biased towards blacks than white, which is the opposite, so we couldn't use that. That's an important finding, by the way, in and of itself, about there are serious issues with the measurement of explicit bias in a medical setting, for reasons I talked about before. So very quickly, because I'm beginning to run out of time. High implicit bias oncologists, the interactions were shorter. The physicians were rated as less supportive by blind observers. And this is something I'm mentioning if we have time to take questions on. They were more likely to describe the side effects of the treatments as mild. That's one of the strongest correlations we've got. But I want to move to patient treatment expectations and want to describe this path diagram to you. What we found, as we found in the earlier study, was that higher physician implicit bias was associated with lower perceived patient-centeredness. But more importantly in the study, what we found is that lower perceived patient-centeredness was associated with less patient confidence in the treatment outcome. They were less sure that the treatment would work. They were also expected more difficulty in completing the treatment. And this was not only found in the perceptions of the patients, it was found in observers' ratings. That is, even the observer ratings, and these observers, of course, were blind as to the physician level of implicit bias. Lower observer ratings of supportiveness, which is an aspect of patient-centeredness, was associated with less patient confidence in the treatment. So the important point I'm trying to make here is that implicit bias not only affects how patients feel about the doctors, but how they feel about the treatments that the doctors are going to recommend. I want to make a quick comment about effect size for the treatment expectations. They run from about 0.10 to 0.15. They're small effects. And one of the issues in the literature is what is the size of the effect for implicit attitudes. Well, first of all, you have to understand, and this is a broader thing that I think other people should understand, that in this context, we should not expect larger treatment effects. Patient treatment expectations are determined by the stage of cancer, their current comorbidities, the physician description of the treatment they get, and the actual difficulty of the treatment. But despite these other powerful determinants, race-related thoughts and feelings significantly predicted important treatment decisions. But what about the size of the effect? It is 4 times as great as the effect of aspirin on myocardial infarctions, heart attacks. And if I ask, I can't see much out here with the light in my eye, but if I ask how many men over 40 are taking baby aspirin at night, probably almost every hand would go up. Our effects are 4 times the size of that. It's also twice as great the effects of 5 to 10 years versus 10 years of chemotherapy on breast cancer recurrence. And most importantly, across large number of interactions, these small effects can result in important racial differences in successful oncology interaction outcomes. Actually, the difference, which I could show you if I had the time, is predicted to be 2,000 per 100,000 patient interactions. So what we're saying is that we might be able to attribute a significant number of unsuccessful. What do I mean by unsuccessful? Unsuccessful in this context means that the patient makes a decision on something other than medical reasons, makes patient on the basis perhaps of the implicit bias displayed by the physician. So quickly, how do we solve this? Well, let me tell you the solutions that won't work. Telling physicians to control their bias. As Jack DeVito and I said in a chapter we recently wrote, it may actually cause the physicians to become more self-focused, more oriented towards monitoring their own performance, and more towards learning about the particular needs and concerns of the black patient with whom they are interacting. Some suggestions that we put forth in an article that Jack, Irene Blair, and I wrote. Talk's getting long. We talked about physicians-focused approaches, induce physicians to individuate their patient. We think this is a critical thing. The patient is a unique person, not simply representative of some racial ethnic group. She is Mrs. Brown or Ms. Brown or Mr. Brown or Mr. Smith or Ms. Green, not a black woman or a black man. We can teach communication patient-centered skills to physicians. This doesn't specifically deal with race, but our belief is that if physicians are generally better able to communicate, that interactions, both racially discordant and racially concordant, will improve. We can make interventions with the patients, teach the patients alliance building and relational communication, and we can create among the physicians and the patients a sense of common group identity. We were able to do this in a study done in the primary care clinic. We were not successful with the physicians, but we were able to increase the patient's level of trust of the physician, and perhaps most importantly, their level of adherence 6 months later. And finally, and this is the most controversial thing, is to use a systems level physician approach. That involves 2 things. One, today, most healthcare systems are huge entities encompassing large numbers of hospitals in a variety of settings. And one of the things we've suggested is to use aggregated data to provide the organization with feedback on disparities in the treatment of black and white patients. Then it becomes an issue of quality control, not an issue of racial prejudice. And many large healthcare organizations are doing that. And secondly, we believe that it's critically important to increase treatment standardization. This has been proposed by Atul Gawande in a brilliant article in the New Yorker about 3 years ago called The Cheesecake Factory Solution, which in his basic point is that medical care is not standardized even with the same facilities. If we standardize it, we know this as social psychologists, if we increase situational constraints, we reduce the possibility for individual difference variables to emerge. So in conclusion, I want to thank my collaborators and co-authors, people who've worked with me on this for the last 14 years. Literally, it takes a village and a half. And I want to acknowledge the research support we've received. My original grant was the National Institute for Child Health and Development. And then my wife and collaborator, Terry Albrecht, has received an R01 from NCI, and then most recently a U54 program project, which has funded the research that I've been doing. Also now has received funding from National Institute of Nursing Research, and I want to acknowledge SPICI, who gave me a SAGES Award to support part of this research. Thank you.
In the past years, I've been invited by many organizations to share current knowledge on implicit bias. And initially I was puzzled by the mixed responses I received, despite the consistency of the available evidence. People conveyed denial, anger, or depression. They bargained with the results I presented. And this reminded me of the famous stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified that people show after traumatic loss. So apparently people experience some sense of loss when they realize that bias persists despite their best intentions that has to be overcome. And the research insights on implicit bias do not resolve this, but they do help people accept that they need to work on additional solutions. So what I would like to share with you today is some of the work that we did in practice to apply the insights from our experimental work on implicit bias to see how we could help people overcome their reluctance to accept the fact they are implicitly biased and how to work with that. So first a little bit about our research, where we show, or where we are convinced that implicit bias is plays a very central role in the whole mechanism of retaining social inequality. So on the part of the perpetrator, people have a strong belief that there are equal opportunities for every individual, and so if people have unequal opportunities, this is ascribed to individual differences in abilities, in motivation, in life choices people make. And so the implicit bias that is conveyed in this way also affects the targets of such bias who suffer from self-doubt and motivation loss and start to underperform, which again reinforces the idea that it's their individual fault, if you wish, that they are receiving less favorable outcomes. So when we look at the evidence that we have gathered in our lab, we have been examining implicit bias in a target group that is relevant in the Dutch society, which is Muslim women. And so we developed materials to test implicit bias against Muslim women, and we also devised a procedure that would allow us to capture additional indicators of psychophysiological reactivity, brain activity in EEG, fMRI, and skin conductance. I will present some results of that as well. So what we try to do is to find different ways to reduce implicit bias, at first in a lab. So what we did was we found that when we emphasized the moral implications of the implicit bias test, then people were able to suppress their bias. So they showed a lower D-score when they thought they were being tested for their moral values than when they thought they were being tested for their ability to learn to make the correct key presses. We also see evidence in the brain activity in the EEG showing us that this is not just controlling the response, the motor response on a task, but it's also the conviction that they are being tested for their moral values, makes people more attentive to the task and makes them more responsive to task stimuli in a way that shows that they are more motivated to perform well on the task. Another intervention we tried in the lab was to see whether the presence of a target group audience representative would make a difference. And here we see also that when people think that their performance is being monitored by a representative of the target group, then their bias scores are lower. Sorry, I have to use my notes because the screen here in front of me is not working very well. Another intervention that we tried in the lab was to see whether people would respond to approval or disapproval from an in-group member or an out-group member. And in our experimental studies, we just used a minimal group membership. So the other person watching you would be a P-type or O-type individual, just as yourself. And here we see that the mere conviction that your performance is being approved or disapproved by somebody who could be considered as an in-group member is also a way to reduce implicit bias. And finally, even when there is a target member present in the situation which is already reducing the level of bias, we see that it can be even reduced even more when we lead people to believe that the target member representative is also a member of the minimal in-group. So there are different ways that we see in our laboratory studies that we can reduce people's implicit bias, or at least the way they score on the implicit bias tests with the different interventions that we tried to use in the lab. Now, of course, a first requirement for people in the field or in real life to be motivated to change anything about the situation is that they first need to be convinced that there is even a problem with discrimination and systematic inequality. And here we see also in experimental work that as long as people are convinced that discrimination is just incidental, that they are more likely to express anger at individuals who protest against their treatment, and they are only accepting of people who protest when they are convinced that the disadvantage is not incidental but structural. So convincing people of the structural nature of bias or implicit bias is a very important precondition for people to accept any attempts to change. Now, when we take all this experimental work that we did in our lab and all the opportunities we have to make very nice random allocation to experimental conditions and controlled measures, and we take that to the field, we have to invent different ways of using that knowledge in order to see whether we can achieve a change. So this is what we do actually in our lab, and it's a very explicit goal that we have, is to connect the experimental work and the basic science that we do to try to connect to real-world problems in two areas. One is ethical behavior in integrity lab, which I will discuss in a talk tomorrow. And the other part that we apply our knowledge to is in the diversity lab, where we connect to companies who have issues with diversity. So if we look at how our results can inform those practical issues, when we talk to people in the workplace and we tell them about implicit bias, mostly people become very depressed and discouraged, because they say, well, if I'm not aware that I'm discriminating, or if I'm not aware that I'm biased, how can I change this? And so this whole idea that it happens implicitly, it's very disconcerting for people, because it feels like they cannot control that outcome. So when we take our results from the experimental study seriously, we know that we might help them to improve their behavior when we emphasize the moral implications of their behavior. So we raise awareness of the fact that they might be biased, and we try to avoid inducing a moral threat, because that is likely to raise defensive responses. We think we might help them by making them aware of the target audience, then they would like to be doing what they should be doing. And we could also emphasize the fact that they share a common identity, for instance, in a professional sense. So there are 3 examples of projects that we are involved in where we try to apply these insights. So one of them is actually started with all kinds of stories that we received from women in academic workplace, who were telling us their experiences with implicit gender discrimination. And at the same time, we were talking to the decision makers in the academic world, and they were really puzzled what was going on, because they told us, well, we have all these goals to treat men and women equally, we have all these provisions in place, and we don't understand why these women are not more happy, why they're not more successful in their careers, and why they're not thriving more. And so they really couldn't understand. So there was a discrepancy between the realities that these women reported to us and the realities as perceived by the university administrators. So this prompted us to make available the information that we had received in this way on a website, and we combined the factual information about what is explicit bias, what is implicit bias, where can you find scientific evidence on how this works, but we also combined this with the personal stories that people sent us, and we anonymized these stories because we didn't want to make people expose people as individuals, but we wanted to clarify the issues that were there, and we deliberately chose a format that would be more or less threatening to people. So we adopted this logo of Athena's Angels. We had an artist prepare cartoons because we thought it was very important to have a tone in these information provisions that would not be threatening to people, but so that they could accept the evidence without feeling blamed and without becoming defensive about it. And so the Netherlands is a very small country, so when we launched this website, it attracted a lot of media attention, and it was all over the national news. And so people approached us and said, okay, so now we realize that there is a problem, so how can we change this? How can we change our implicit associations? And we explained that the implicit associations are being kept in place because people are exposed to this information, that they always see white men as the prototype of the successful academic, and the only way to change the implicit associations is to change these images. So then we engaged in a project with Leiden University, and it's an historic, oldest university in the Netherlands, so they have these historic buildings. And in the room where everybody receives their PhD degree and defends their degree, the whole wall is full of historical portraits of professors of the university, and of course these are all white men except for one woman who is there. So what we did as a project with the university board was we made photo portraits of all the female professors in the university. And during a period of time, they were printed on screens, and they were hung in front of the portraits of the male professors. And William of Orange is the founder of this university, and normally his portrait is in the mantelpiece on the fireplace. And so the former Queen Beatrix, who has an honorary doctorate of this university, she agreed to have her portrait replace the portrait of William of Orange during this project. So it was an art project. It was deliberately also presented as such. But again, and on the portrait in the front, that's the only one woman who is actually there usually on the wall with the dead guys. And so this performance or this art project attracted, again, a lot of attention, and it was publicized very widely, and it actually convinced the university board that this was a very important mission and that it was a very important statement that they could make. And so the four of us, Athena's Angels, are on the right-hand side, our portraits, and because this was such a big success, the university board decided to put our four portraits up in the room where they make their decisions. And the chancellor of the university told us that when they make decisions that might affect careers of men and women, they look at our portraits in the wall and they ask each other, what would the angels think about this? And so on our website we have this stamp which is Angels Approved, and we use it also to publicize activities of decision makers where we think they're making a positive difference. So we not only publicize the negative examples that we get, but we also publicize the positive examples. And I think this combination, so for a long time I thought just conveying the science and conveying the information should be the way to educate people. And from this whole activity associated with the website, it convinced me that that's not enough just for providing the information. So you have to make it nice or fun. You also have to give people rewards for positive behaviors, and this has, in our country, this has had a huge impact. Now, due to this activity as Athena's Angels, we were also collaborating with the Minister of Education, who is a woman still. We have had new elections, so we'll have a new minister soon. She's a woman. And there is also, first time in history, there's a woman president of the Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences. So we had a lot of discussion with these women, and at first they were reluctant to work for women in science because they didn't want to be the woman who is working for women in science, but we had a lot of interactions with them. And this year is 100 years ago that the first female professor was appointed in the Netherlands, and this was an occasion for them to take action. So the Minister of Education, she ordered all the universities to appoint 100 additional female professors. And the Royal Academy of Sciences had one extra round of receiving members, only women. And so at first we got a lot of negative responses, so people thought that was not very good because it would imply that we would have lower quality candidates and that women would be stigmatized. But these processes are now ongoing of appointing these women and finding these women. And it turns out that there were very many high-quality women. And so we got this surprised comments that, oh, there are so many talented women out there, and we just didn't find them. So from that point of view, some people hate us and think we are criminals, that we do this, hence the cartoon. But I think a lot of difference was made because we realized that we can't just give people the information about implicit bias. We also have to work with them how to improve this in a positive way. So this is the first example that I want to share with you. The second example is a collaboration that we did with the National Academy of Sciences, who saw year after year that in the applications that they received for personal career grants, the proportion of women that were awarded was always significantly lower than the proportion of male candidates that was awarded. And so we examined their records at their request, and we found actually that evaluations of the project proposals by men and women, and also the knowledge utilization of these proposals, there was no gender difference, but there was only a gender difference in how the individual performance record of the individual candidate was evaluated. And part of this evaluation is an interview, which is, of course, an opportunity for implicit bias to emerge. And at the same time, we also examined the verbal materials that were used to instruct candidates and to instruct evaluators and to instruct committee members. And we found that there was a lot of gendered language in these materials. So the terms that were being used to define research excellence are terms that are associated with the masculine stereotype, and that could be a source of implicit bias. So the National Science Foundation asked us to use this knowledge to develop a procedure to help committee members avoid implicit bias. And so as part of this procedure, which is now ongoing in the evaluation rounds, is that we developed an IIT where we use these terms that are embedded in the evaluation materials, and we invited the committee members to do an IIT based on these terms, and we made very explicit that the aim of the National Science Foundation was to make them aware of this and to help them to make fair judgments of men and women. And what we see here is that if we have a normal population of undergraduate students who responds to these terms, we see clear evidence of gender bias. But if we ask committee members, when we have made explicit the moral implications of their responses, we see that they are able to suppress the bias. So we are currently examining whether that also works through in their judgments, and it actually helps, hopefully, to have the female candidates have an equal opportunity to be selected. And the final example, what we do is where we work with ethnic minority students in vocational training. They have to find an internship in companies in order to complete their education. And the ethnic minority students have bigger difficulties in finding these internships. And we think it is because there is implicit ethnic bias among the employers. So what we do here is work with these people to emphasize the common identity that they share, make them focus on the professional identity that they share together with the students instead of focusing on the ethnic identity that separates them. And as part of this program, we do master classes where the people who are involved, they on site, they participate in the IAT, and we give them back their results, and that helps them acknowledge that they have perhaps issues with implicit bias, and that makes them open to guidelines that we develop on the basis of all the evidence there is of conditions that need to be met for initial contact to be successful and to overcome first impressions that may be negative. And so using the IAT in this way as a demonstration tool makes people more open to work with us and to work according to the evidence-based guidelines that we give them instead of relying on their common sense. So if we try to use the experimental and research evidence that we have from very basic research to find out how we can interrupt bias in the workplace, this helps us and the people that we work with to go beyond their common sense, because it helps us document instances of implicit bias. It helps people understand what does it mean, what do people encounter, and that is an important precondition for people to start changing. It helps us educate people about how implicit bias can work, how policymakers, how evaluators can take this into account or compensate for that. And it also helps us to develop guidelines that people are willing to accept to overcome their implicit bias. And this is what we do in the project with the internship matches. And what we have also started to do, because we realize that a lot of the scientific knowledge that we have available is not very accessible to people in practice and in the workplace. And yet the people that we speak to are very eager to find out about these things. So what we also have been investing in is in writing low-level accessible texts for people in practice who give them access to the scientific knowledge that we have in a way that is useful for them. So that was what I wanted to tell you today. Thank you very much.